questions. This question says, why do you think it seems easier to feel one side of my body than the other? Habit, most likely. It's what you're more used to paying attention to. So as you start to become familiar with your body, you'll find that there are parts of your body which you feel intensely, and parts of your body which you're almost completely ignorant of. And this doesn't necessarily line up with where nerve endings are more dense, but rather it has to do with what you habitually pay more attention to or pay less attention to. So as you develop a thorough mindfulness practice, then you'll start to feel more completely and more thoroughly. So during this retreat, that's not so relevant. So during this retreat, we're just focusing on our hands as our primary object. But one of the other meditation techniques that I often teach is mindfulness of the entire body. So feeling your entire body with equal intensity all over, every region all at once. And in that kind of practice, then you will start to feel parts of your body that you normally don't pay much attention to. Yeah, it's just habit. We're used to ignoring things. Next question. On chanting, is there a reason why no two Buddhist schools chant the same way? So there are many different styles of chanting, and there's no one correct style per se. So the words do have a correct pronunciation, and there also is a correct timing. So in Pali and in Sanskrit, as I mentioned on the yesterday, I believe, every syllable is either slow or fast, and that's a default of the syllable itself. That's built into the language. It's part of the pronunciation. So that's universal, the pronunciation and the timing. But then beyond that, then you have all kinds of styles. So there's no tones inherent in Pali and in Sanskrit. So how you chant it, whether you chant it in a monotone or whether you chant it sing-songy with up and down and all that, is your own choice. And there are a number of specific styles of chanting that do sound a bit more on the sing-songy side. I tend to be less fond of those styles myself. I tend to be more a fan of monotone. As far as jamming together the end of one line with the beginning of the next line, that's also another style. So one style is to chant continuously from start to finish, as though there were no gaps, no separations. And that works particularly well when you have a large group of people all chanting together. Another style is to have rational pauses. Like when we speak, we don't speak non-stop. We normally make rational pauses to separate statements. The other style is making rational pauses. So like when we speak, we pause at the end of a sentence, or we pause at the end of a phrase, or we pause where there's a break in the logic of the sentence. So that's another style of chanting, is then chanting in sentences or in phrases. And that's particularly effective if you're chanting by yourself, or if you're chanting with maybe just one or two other people. So again, there's different styles. There's no right style or wrong style. It's just a matter of what people are trained in or what they're personally fond of doing.
Well, it occurs to mention that Buddhism was originally transmitted orally. So word of mouth and the passing of the Dhamma from one person to the next has always been very important. And chanting was often used as a way of getting everyone to know the Dhamma and to be on the same page. You would all start chanting, and when somebody fell out of step, you go, oh, I misremembered that. And you would compare your notes, and then you would decide, okay, no, it had to be that way. That's has that long vowel. and then you continue. And this is why the Dhamma has made it to the present era, through several hundred years where they didn't write anything down. So as far as why different traditions have different chanting, it's what they're choosing to remember. You know, what you chant every day is what you value. And different communities naturally have found different sets of dhammas useful.
And that's also an important point in that particularly the poetry in the canon has a particular rhythm. And that rhythm is meant to aid your memorization. So that when you know, for example, that a line can only have 5 syllables, then if you're remembering the line as having 6 syllables, then you've clearly misremembered something. So then that, the phonetic structuring of it then is meant to help you in remembering it. Next question. If mind can perceive only one object at a time, how is it possible to be aware of sounds and have one pointed attention on an object? Feedback. Is this a distinction between commentarial tradition and sutra description of jhanas? So the idea that the mind can only perceive one object at a time actually does come not from the suttas, but rather from the Abhidhamma commentary, I believe. So it's not even in the Abhidhamma, the canonical Abhidhamma, quote-unquote canonical Abhidhamma, since it emerged over the following 300 years after the Buddha's death. But the concept that the mind can perceive only one object at a time emerged in the commentaries on the Abhidhamma. That said, I have never, as far as I can recall, I have never encountered a teacher who argues with that particular point. I've encountered all kinds of teachers who argue with all sorts of other things the commentaries say. But that particular thing of the mind perceiving only one object at a time, I've never seen anybody argue with that point. And as far as my own intellectual consideration of that, it just makes so much sense that the mind perceives one object at a time. But now that I'm considering it, like, does it actually have to be that way? Could the mind perceive 2 things at a time or more? It's a good question. Usually the way it's explained is that when you feel like you're perceiving multiple objects at a time, what's actually happening is that you're perceiving individual objects in close succession. Like you think, I'm paying attention to 2 things at the same time, but actually it's that you're switching between the 2 very rapidly. So again, in commentarial Abhidhamma, there's the idea that a single mind moment, so a single moment of awareness, takes place on the level of a very small fraction of a second. I've seen different estimates as to exactly how long a mind moment is, but we're talking somewhere between 1/10,000th of a second to 1/1,000,000th of a second. It's somewhere in that range. So very, very quick. So that means in any one given second, we can have thousands of sequential moments of perception, which could be thousands of separate objects being perceived sequentially. So then in the course of a single second, then it would seem like we were perceiving thousands of different things more or less simultaneously. So, I mean, this all becomes somewhat academic because the question is, what is our experience in any given moment? So in any given moment, if our experience is of having one pointed attention on an object, but there's still some background noise going on, then these fine distinctions start to become somewhat irrelevant, because that's our experience. So this is one point where there is a certain danger in getting a little too caught up in intellectualizing the Dhamma. And that ultimately Dhamma has to be experiential. If it's purely intellectual, it's no good to anyone. It has to be experiential. in order to be of real benefit, in order to be life transforming. In my experience, yes, you can in fact have completely solid concentration on an object while still having peripheral awareness of other senses. Yeah, in my experience that is possible. So whether you want to say that the mind is actually perceiving multiple objects at the same time, or whether you want to say that the mind is sequentially perceiving separate objects but just spending a lot more time on the dominant object, well, I don't really see the point in those fine distinctions, because what's your experience? Your experience is your dominant attention is on your object, and you're also peripherally aware of other phenomena. So if that's your experience, that's your experience. So Buddhism is not really so concerned with pinning down some absolute, but rather it's more concerned about what your experience is in the present moment and how to work with that in order to bring you in the direction of enlightenment. And as you work towards enlightenment, then the nature of absolute truth becomes increasingly apparent. But you'll deal with that when you get there. It's not something you need to worry about so much right now. Next question. Do you have any comments on that? Okay. Just want to clarify, when you were talking about sitting with pain, you mean pain that occurs in limbs or body from a prolonged sitting, right? We are not talking about a toothache, broken leg, or something else more serious, since pain is a signal that something is wrong with the body and requires attention, right? Or do you suggest to refuse medication and sit through cancer or surgery as well? So just to clarify, actually, when I talk about dealing with pain, I mean all pain. So I say this because I want you to attain enlightenment. I don't say this just because I want you to hurt. But rather, I say this because if you do not learn how to deal with pain, you will not attain enlightenment. It's really as simple as that. So as long as you have some sensations that you're unwilling to face up to, some sensations where you're willing to harbor aversion towards those sensations, then you will not attain enlightenment. The Buddha actually directly stated that a complete understanding of pleasant, painful, and neutral is equivalent to complete enlightenment. The two come hand in hand. So if you can explore pain and understand pain completely, that's all you've got to do. So yeah, that does mean everything. If you have a toothache or a broken leg, then investigate that pain. Try to develop equanimity towards it. Develop an ability to accept that experience without rejecting it or pushing it away. Now, as to the question of refusing medication, by this I assume you mean refusing painkillers. I'm not 100% convinced that I would actually count painkillers as medication, because they don't heal anything. All they do is reduce your experience of pain, and also tend to induce a number of unhelpful side effects, such as a loss of mindfulness. But that aside, it is also important to evaluate the strength of your own practice, of asking yourself, is my practice strong enough that I can actually face this intensity of pain with dignity, with equanimity, with composure, and be able to learn something from it? Because when one's practice is relatively weak and one faces extremely intense pain, then one might not be able to deal with it, and one can become overwhelmed. One can just get lost in the misery and lose sight of the practice. One can lose sight of this practice of investigating pain. So that is something. If your practice is weak and you're experiencing very intense pain, then yeah, you might use painkillers just to lower the pain to a level that you can deal with. Lower the pain to a level that you can investigate and work with your aversion towards. So again, it's kind of like when you start, say, weightlifting, lifting weights. You start by lifting light weights until you build up some strength, and then you move on to medium weights until you get even more strength, and then you move on to lifting the really heavy weights. But you don't just go directly to lifting heavy weights, or else you won't be able to do it. It's just out of your reach. So in the same way, when you start investigating pain, start with more mild pain, less severe pain. And as your ability to deal with pain increases, then correspondingly you can deal with more intense pain. As for sitting through cancer or surgery without medication, there are many cases of monks and nuns who have done that, who sat through surgery without taking medication, and they just maintained mindfulness and equanimity of the experience. Yeah, I can think of many, many examples of well-known monastics who endured extreme pain with dignity because they saw the negative side effects of painkillers as not being worth it. And their own practice was strong enough that they could face pain with dignity. As for signals that something is wrong with the body, again, as I mentioned the other day, you can recognize that signal and do something about it without being agitated or bothered or disturbed. So you can just recognize, like if you step on something sharp, then you can acknowledge that you need to take your foot off that sharp object before damage happens. And you can take your foot off the sharp object. That's all fine. But you can do so without suffering the slightest bit about the pain, without creating the experience of pain. So again, this is not an easy practice, which is why it's such a wonderful thing to develop in sitting meditation when you're in a very safe situation. So you're sitting quietly in a room with nice people. It's just about the safest situation to investigate pain I can think of. And then you can start to apply it in other situations. Do you have comments?
Just that it seems the matter at hand with pain is the matter of reaction. So pain is a given. It's a human experience. You can't really get away from it. What we're working with is our reactions. And we're cutting down on reactions. Habitual reactions, instinctual reactions, everything we don't have control over. And more as you do that, as you sort of work through reactions and put them down and get past them and see through them, all that will be left is action. Just action, informed action. You will see the pain and you will decide what needs to be done with it. If you can imagine what that might be like, then you can maybe see, how monks and nuns could go through surgery without needing any sort of painkillers. You might be able to see how you actually could choose a painkiller though for somebody who's on their deathbed. Like a few more minutes of coherent thought to say some last words. You see, there's nuances there. If you're not reacting to it, then you can make an informed decision. There's a koan in the Zen tradition, and it asks, what is the ceaseless activity of all the Buddhas? And as the story goes, eventually a student figured it out, and he said, an appropriate response. So that's all enlightenment is. You're not reacting to the world. You're not trying to change the world. You're just making an informed, appropriate response to things as they come up. And you can't do that if you don't start.
On one more practical note, if you are faced with extreme pain and you do decide to use painkillers, I'd recommend using the bare minimum you need. Bare minimum. Even if that means you still have a little bit of pain, that's great, because then you have something to work with. I recall during one of the first Zen retreats I sat, I went to one of the teachers and I was lamenting like, oh, I've got so much pain, my legs hurt so bad, my back hurts so bad, and she's like, that's great, I'm so glad you're having pain. And I'm like, what? And then she explained to me about working with pain, and I'm like, okay, I got it, that makes sense. What is the highest jhana that each of you attained, dear monastics? Next question. So that's slightly gauche. It's a little bit... there are some questions which are considered slightly inappropriate to ask. So usually, so there's a rule actually, in the monastic code, there's a rule that if a monk or nun attains some significant degree of success in their practice, such as attaining jhana to any level, or attaining any degree of enlightenment or liberation, they're not allowed to brag about it. But instead what you'll see they do is they hint at what they have achieved. So instead of directly saying it, they'll make hints. Or you'll hear other people who have talked to them talk about what that monk has mentioned. So if you just directly ask a monk, like, how much jhana do you got? Then he's not going to answer. But if you listen closely when he talks about it, when he talks about jhana, if you listen closely, then you might suss out what his experience is. Next question. Oh, unless you want to answer that. How much jhana do you have?
It's okay to just let that one slide.
Let's see. During the most recent sit, the insight arose in me that making my mind imperturbable like the earth, a la the Buddha's instructions to Rahula, great sutta, by the way, bonus points to whoever's reading that sutta, could calm down my restlessness and anxiety. Could you speak about making the mind imperturbable like earth as a practice in meditation? Do you want to take this one? What are you here for? So making the mind imperturbable like the earth. Well, just look at the earth. It doesn't move. No matter what happens, it's not bothered. Again, as I recall in that sutta, the Buddha says people throw things on the earth, they urinate on the earth, they pour water on the earth, they discard trash on the earth, and the earth is completely unbothered, it's unmoved, it's unaffected. So then we develop a mind the same way. Whatever happens, whatever we see, hear, smell, taste, touch, or mentally perceive, we're unbothered, we're undisturbed, the same way the earth is undisturbed, regardless of who walks on it or throws things on it. It doesn't matter to the earth. So developing that same degree of immovability, of composure, dignity. Go for it.
So it's interesting to think. We don't always get an example of how this might play out, but in Rahula's case later on, there's an anecdote in the monks of India where there's a lot of great stories of Rahula, and Rahula was attending on a senior monk, and Rahula was the first novice, so he was the first young lad around the monastery, and he didn't always get the most respect. And it's this particular case, after these instructions to Rahula, some time had passed, maybe some years, and Rahula is attending on this monk, and the monk is saying to another elder monk, he's like, "This novice is great. It's incredible. You just watch what happens." And he goes and he picks up one of his robes and he puts it there in the middle of the floor, just sort of drops it. And then he said, Rahula! And Rahula comes scurrying in, yes, Venerable Sir. Yes, Venerable Sir. And he's like, there's a robe on the floor. And obviously we know it's to it. Most of us would be pretty ticked off. It's like, I just cleaned your room, Venerable Sir. But Rahula's like, oh yes, so it is, Venerable Sir. And he just scooped up the robe and he folded it nicely and put it back. I said, is there anything else? No. Yes, okay. And he went off back to his practice. The imperturbable. That's what it looks like to not take offense. You just, oh, this is what I'm supposed to do. You don't read into it any further than that.
Okay. Next question. Can you describe in more detail the rapture feeling you experienced while in Jhana? I thought I described it in a fair amount of detail already.
I mean, I'd like to throw in something on that. Even in the case of drugs or sex or food or a television show, these are sensual pleasures, and you might notice something about them. Eventually, it gets boring, and eventually you okay, I've had enough rapture. Let's go on to something else. That's what sensual pleasures are like. Not so with pīti. Not so with this rapture. If you have it, you will willingly spend the entire night just looking at it and going, oh, oh, oh. and you will get up in the morning, even if you had no sleep at all, and you'll say, oh, it was pretty good. So it's really something quite different from anything you could compare it to in the physical realm.
He does have a point there. Yeah, it doesn't get old. Yeah, suffice to say, it's just incredibly intense full-body euphoria. Call it what you will. And it's produced solely by sitting down, holding still, and focusing your mind. This is part of what's so amazing about it and why it tends to be such a significantly transformative experience. Is you recognize that you don't need anything outside yourself. You don't need to get anything or go anywhere or do anything or find anyone. All you have to do is sit down, hold still, and focus your mind. So it really changes the way that we look at sensuality. And we start to recognize that sensuality is really not that important compared to what you can do with your own mind. Next question. Once someone attains jhana, can they generally get to it again after retreat ends, such as in daily life? Also, for longer retreats than 10 days, how to balance samatha and vipassana? A bit of insight each day or wait till the end? So, once you first have a taste of jhana, then it's much easier to get back. Because you know what it feels like, you know what you're aiming towards. So yeah, that does make it easier to get to. That said, jhana is dependent upon strong concentration. And that's easiest to get in retreat environments. Or if you're living a very peaceful lifestyle. Like if you're living in a monastery or living in a retreat center, or maybe if you're retired, or if you work from home but you have a really chill, laid-back job or something, and you do a lot of meditation every day and you don't talk to people very much at all, then yeah. I mean, that's the thing, is that jhana, this is one reason also, one way we can reflect on the drawbacks of jhana, and I'll get to that later, is that jhana is fairly reliant upon conditions. It's actually not something you can get in the midst of a hectic lifestyle. So if you have like a really busy job and a really engaged social life, and you watch a lot of TV, and yeah, you're going to have a really hard time getting jhana outside of retreats. But if you live a very peaceful, composed, dignified life, then yeah, as long as you do plenty of meditation and you really try hard in your practice, then yeah, you can get jhana in your daily life. As for balancing samatha and vipassana, that's really up to you. You have to do what gets you the most progress. So there's not a hard and fast rule. Like everyone must do 50% samatha, 50% vipassana, or 10%, 90%, or 80%, 20%. There is no hard and fast rule. You have to feel it out for yourself. So it's whatever brings you towards enlightenment. And yeah, again, you can consult with more experienced practitioners, but ultimately it's a matter of being honest with yourself about your own experience. Next question. How is use of the primary object, for example, focusing on the sensations of the hands, different in concentration meditation than usage of the same meditation object for vipassana meditation? For example, one can scan throughout the hand for all the variety of sensations as was part of our instruction yesterday. Conversely, one can scan the same hand in vipassana or track a sound vipassanized. If a main difference between concentration and vipassana insight meditation is the presence of investigation, is there a need to abstract the meditation object by making it more solid, i.e. fixed? Someone's thinking about this way too much. Basically, so the reason why I spoke about moving your attention through the hand yesterday is that's just a way of keeping your attention on the hand. If you're finding you're getting bored or distracted, then putting a little bit of activity into the meditation is just a way of keeping your attention on your hand. You will not get jhana if you're moving your attention around. Your attention has to be stable, fixed, in order for you to attain jhana. Again, as for the difference between using an object for concentration and using it for insight, so in this specific example, so paying attention to your body, your hands in this case. With concentration practice, you're just holding your attention steady on the object. That's it. With insight practice, and there's many ways you can do insight practice. One way is to observe the constant change in your physical sensations. So developing the perception of impermanence. Another is the investigation of feeling, as I believe was mentioned in here. So observing pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, and observing the reactive tendency in relation to each, and observing how those reactive tendencies create suffering. That would also be a form of insight practice. So again, it's with concentration practice is relatively simple and straightforward. You just hold your attention on the object unwavering. That's it. Insight is where you're investigating the object in terms of the three universal characteristics. Dukkha, anicca, anatta. Unsatisfactory, impermanent, and impersonal. So that's when it becomes insight meditation. So if you're investigating pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, observing the reaction and noticing how the reaction creates dukkha, then you're investigating dukkha in relation to that experience. If you're watching the constant shift and change of that experience, you're investigating impermanence. If you're reflecting that this is not me, this is not mine, this is not who I am, then you're investigating not self. So that's insight meditation, which once again is not what we're doing during this retreat. If you're doing insight meditation, then you're not following my instructions. Which I will discover, because tomorrow we're going to start doing private discussions, one-on-one. So I will learn your secrets. And no, there's no need to abstract the meditation object. That sounds like a disaster in the making. Just stay with the experience as it is. Abstracting the meditation object has a tendency to turn into daydreaming, into imagination. And while there is a way of using imagination in the service of our meditation practice, I would not recommend it when dealing with a physical mindfulness object. Because you're just going to break your physical mindfulness. It just turns into a mental abstraction. So again, there is such a thing as kasina meditation, which is concentration on a mental abstraction. But that's not recommended for many people, because for many people that just turns into daydreaming. just turns into imagination. It can become unproductive or even harmful if it's not done correctly. So meditation on a mental abstraction is normally recommended to be done only under the close guidance of a teacher. And I normally don't teach that kind of meditation. I can talk about it, but I normally don't teach it. Also, it's not what I'm teaching during this retreat, so don't do it during this retreat. If you want to try it after the retreat, go ahead, but talk with people about your experience. Do you have any comments on those before I go to the next question? There's more.
Just the difference between vipassana and samatha. Yeah, it really seems like a bit more thought than is warranted or is productive. Vipassana, often you're sort of stepping back from an experience to look at it, to analyze it, to see its features. You notice that creates two things going on. There's the object and there's the subject. And this is very useful for vipassana, and it's even more useful when your mind is steadied, so that you'll stay with one object and you won't go off on a tangent and think or go from object to object to object, but you'll just stay and really see the characteristics of an object. But to be clear, when you do this stepping back, you're not going to get concentration. So vipassana and samatha are distinct in that way. If you're abstracting anything from the experience, it's not going to settle. It's not going to lead to peace and concentration. So consider that. Even when we talk about experiencing pain and knowing it is just pain, this is not a mental thing that you're doing. You're not saying, here's pain, it's just pain. It's not painful, it's just a sensation, just a sensation, I see it, ha. No, you're just experiencing it. And if you do that, if you just experience it, then it won't have the mental pain component. It'll just be an experience, and just one experience to just another experience to just another experience. That's the stepping stones to concentration.
It's actually a very good point that Venerable makes regarding pain. So if you're experiencing pain and you just start telling yourself, it's not pain, it's not pain, it's not pain, that doesn't help at all. You have to actually experience it fully and completely in order to recognize it's not pain. Next question. So at what point do these two different approaches converge or blank completely in one another? Does this occur in any of the jhanas? In the Yogananda Sutta, the Buddha talks about 3 approaches to meditation. So first one develops concentration and then insight. Or first one develops insight and then concentration. Or one develops both in tandem. So ways in which one can develop both in tandem are... one of the easiest ways of doing that is actually with the perception of impermanence. So as you're focusing on an object, you maintain the awareness of its constant change. That would be an example of practicing both in tandem. Also, just in general, you develop concentration, and then as you're doing insight practice, you're holding your mind on the object that you're investigating. So that is, it requires concentration, but it's also developing or maintaining a certain degree of concentration. Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, physical mindfulness and the perception of impermanence and the perception of not-self go together extremely well. Do you have any other thoughts on that?
I don't have a sutta reference, but in my personal opinion, the place where samatha and vipassana meet is right here. I mean, you look left and look right. It's you coming to the retreat. It's you stepping out of your busy life. It's you sitting down on the cushion. It's you going off and meditate. That's what you get from doing samatha vipassana. Your life gets better. The Buddha, he describes sometimes vipassana like two hands that are washing each other. When you really come to understand, we describe them as two things because they're developed slightly independently with slightly different skill sets. But the result is one thing. The path is always one thing. You don't have to split it up. And that's what you're getting every day.
In this discourse, Majjhima Nikaya 111, the Buddha does talk about investigating the impermanence of the mental factors of jhana while one is in jhana. And that applies for all 4 of the physical jhanas and for the first 3 of the non-physical jhanas. So it's only in the highest formless non-physical jhanas that one's attention becomes too insubstantial to be able to practice insight meditation while you're in jhana. So yeah, you definitely can practice insight meditation while in the first 7 jhanas. It's only in the most refined that it's no longer possible.
And on that point, this particular sutta focuses on Venerable Sariputta, and even though he entered that final attainment, and he couldn't do vipassana while he was there, the moment he came out, his mind was so sharp, he said, "Ah!" And that was his experience of complete liberation of the mind. It's like nibbana is the cessation of suffering. I think it was.
Same here.
So he couldn't do vipassana in that attainment, but the second he dropped out of that attainment, he could do vipassana, and he could see that even that final attainment was impermanent, was suffering and not self.
Anyway, this is one point where there is a substantial difference between the sutta's description of jhana and the commentarial description of jhana. And that the commentarial description of jhana states that it is impossible to do insight practice while in jhana, and that you must emerge first. Whereas in this sutta and in other suttas, it clearly states that you can do insight meditation while in jhana, at least in the first 7 jhanas. So again, minor distinction there, only relevant to will. The rest of you, don't worry about it. I know you. Let's see, this question, I think it's a question, says, noticed towards the end of the morning sit that there was a thrill that ran through my body accompanied by excitement. It's happened often in the past and, while pleasant, always leads to concentration unraveling. I assume the appropriate response is to stay with the object and let these sensations play out, but I've read in the Anapanasati Sutta and the Satipatthana that one should breathe sensitive to rapture / refreshment / pīti. Am I mistaking this thrill and excitement for a kind of fool's pīti? Is my hunch on not reacting on the right track? I would recommend not reacting. I'd recommend remain equanimous. Keep your equanimity. So be aware of the sensation, but don't get caught up in it. Stay on your object. You pretty much always want to stay on your object, especially since you've already noticed that letting your attention drift to that sensation weakens your concentration. You've already made that connection. Then that's definitely a sign that you need to stay on your primary object. Again, this can be a precursor to jhana. It can be an indication that your concentration is strengthening. Or it can just be one of those random weird things that sometimes happens when you meditate. So the truth is, all kinds of random weird stuff happens when you meditate, and it's just not really worth putting too much importance on it. It's just what comes with having a body and mind. It does weird things sometimes. So again, this might be a precursor to actual rapture, to genuine jhana factor rapture, but it might not be. So just stay with your primary object.